Hello, you wonderful people. So for today's video, I'm going to talk about video games, in particular talking to NPCs in video games. Now, I think it's kind of an interesting thing because I've been playing video games since I was a little kid, and I wouldn't consider myself like a hardcore gamer, but I've played a handful of video games in my time, which makes me sound super old. But regardless, the fact of the matter is talking to NPCs is something I haven't always done. Granted, not every game gives you that opportunity. Even more, there's some modern games that won't let you get that opportunity. Obviously, it's like, this is something that can pop up in other games, but I feel like it's very prevalent in JRPGs in particular, because they're the ones that kind of give you the freedom to actually just kind of talk to whoever you want to. But even that's kind of an interesting case, because there's some video games where, every random character you see out and about, you can talk to them. Some games you can't. Like, comparing Final Fantasies, even. Final Fantasy X, you see a character, every NPC you see running around, you can talk to at any point in time, typically. But then you take something like 12. 12 actually did an interesting thing where, there's random NPCs walking around, but in some places, you can't talk to them. Because some of them are, sitting in a position where, there's an invisible wall, so you can't get access to them. They're just in the background doing stuff. And even in, certain cases where, there's a town full of people, there'll just be people you can't talk to. There's only a certain amount of NPCs that actually have dialogue that you can actually talk to. And even transitioning that from, 13 and 15. 13, I think you could literally count on one hand the number of opportunities you have to talk to NPCs in 13. It's just not really a thing in Final Fantasy 13. They change it and make it more of a thing in 2. You definitely have way more opportunities in 13 too. But even 15, there's no actual technically talking to NPCs. Yes, there are, obviously the people from the restaurants and the inns, because obviously when you go to restaurants, those are the people you talk to. You get your hunts and your quests and stuff like that sometimes. But random NPCs, their dialogue auto plays when you walk past them, and that's something Final Fantasy VII adapted, was that whole element of you can just walk past someone and some dialogue will play. Obviously that's an element that Kingdom Hearts 3 has to a certain extent, because there's certain areas in Kingdom Hearts 3 that have random NPCs that you can interact with. Some you can just straight up talk to, but then there are others, I think it has that thing as well where you just walk past them and they play dialogue. I think that's kind of more that condition. The reason why I'm bringing this up, because once again I'm going to bring up Trails of Cold Steel, because it's my own fault, because I played those 3 games back to back, and then I've recently played them back to back again as I've been replaying through them. If you're curious about my progress, I'm about halfway to through my second playthrough of Trails of Cold Steel 3. And just in case you were curious. But nevertheless, lost my train of thought for a second there. But the whole thing is, I'm making more of a conscious effort in those games to talk to all the NPCs, because that was never something, here and there, I always felt like that was too much of a hassle. But I think it's always an interesting thing, just because obviously a lot of NPCs have world building dialogue, because they'll tell you kind of what's going on in the world. They'll, in particular, it's a very important, it's a very interesting thing in Trails, because it's sometimes talking to NPCs works out for you, because in that particular game you can some dialogue will come up foreshadowing, because sometimes you'll talk to students and stuff like that at Thor's in the first game, and there'll be hints to certain side quests you'll end up doing associated with those characters later on in the path. You have a random example would be Becky and Hugo. They kind of have that whole business rivalry that they have. You get more and more of that as the games progress, especially in 1, and the more you talk to them, the more you see that progresses. So, and I always say that's kind of an interesting thing, because there's NPCs that have storylines that if you didn't talk to them, you would never get access to them. Granted, Becky and Hugo fall under that thing of you need to talk to them so you can get access to their profiles, because at certain points in times, elements get added to their profiles, and so it's part of finishing the character profiles. Also, it's part of finishing the notebook section. That kind of means nothing if you never played the game, but regardless, it's interesting, because you get to see certain things kind of play out like that, and it also presents certain interesting opportunities. I think in Trails of Cold Steel 2, you actually get to talk to one of the antagonists before they became an antagonist. Like, it's Duvalie the Swift. Like, when you're in Legram, I think it's before you go to Lohengrin Castle to meet up with Laura and Emma, you just randomly see her in the inn, and she'll be talking mad shit about the Arcade School, and like, oh, this town is quaint and stuff like that, but the Arcade School, they're just a blah, 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 blah. And it's interesting, because I've never seen what happens if you bring Toval and Claire, because I always just end up bringing Sharon. Sharon, well, her dialogue will be 3 ellipsis dots, and then she's like, oh, this person seems interesting, like they'll be powerful. She says something like that. It's like, you as a spoiler, as an enforcer, you know exactly who she is. Darn you, sharing your past. But going on tangents and stuff like that. It's just always interesting what you can like kind of learn from. I mean, I guess that's the whole point of talking to it, because sometimes it's just random dialogue that won't mean as much, but also it's like you get to know characters, especially because like it's so interesting, because not just the characters you get to know, the more important NPCs that have names and faces. You're not just like, oh, copy and pasted like NPCs that look the same as its other character model. I mean, which even that's interesting, because obviously even those character models that do that, they still have their own personalities and stuff like that. Because what was that character? There's a character in Celtic, her name is Louise. She has the same character model as another character, I think it's a merchant named Lizzie. And then there's also a girl that Machias knows from Heimdall, in particular the Heimdall, sorry, the neighborhood, the Ost district, or Ost, I'm not trying to pronounce it, the district he grew up in. I'm blanking on how you properly pronounce her name. It's something with a P. Like, her and Machias have history, so like she has a very distinct personality. And the thing is, it's funny because that character model is only used once in 3, because they used her, they bring her back in Trails of Cold Steel 3. So it's just interesting little things like that. So it's like, oh, here's a character you see in 1 and 2. Yes, she doesn't have the most unique character model, but now she does, because she's the only one with that particular character model in 3. And I think they made a point of that because they wanted to bring over like a recurring character. And so it's like I said, that's an NPC you wouldn't really know too much about if you didn't like just talk to her from time to time, because there's even quests associated with her in 2, because her and the little kid she kicks it with sometimes, because they're kind of like delinquents. Like the other one, like they get separated in 2 and you have to reunite them, and it's a whole thing. I think I've made a point of it, in going through all 3 Cold Steels. At least my first time through, I try to talk to every NPC, but you end up finding like some very interesting, like I said, information. Like I said, a lot of it's world building, some of it's character building, because it's like, oh, some of this associates with characters. You're like, oh, you learn, and sometimes some of it does present dialogue where your characters do respond. They're like, oh, that's interesting, because sometimes there's NPC dialogue where it's just kind of like, it's just to you, the player, even though they are talking to the character in front of them. But like, it's really a situation, I feel like, in NPC in video games where the main character will actually kind of respond. I think it's kind of a fascinating thing. But like I said, the first time through, I've tried to make more of a point to talk to like every NPC, especially in those games, because the dialogue changes from time to time, in the sense of like, in 1, there's a day and afternoon cycle. Like, once you complete a certain number of quests, the game will shift over, or rather, you complete a certain quest during the first game, it'll shift over into an afternoon segment, and that's when the dialogue changes. Obviously, there's situations where like you're in a place for a day or 2 because you go on your field studies, field exercises in 3. But even like 2, like it also depends, because you have like a little more freedom in 2 to kind of go different places at different points in the story. It's a whole thing, but it's just like there's opportunities where an NPC's dialogue will change, and you're not always in that position, because sometimes for you to witness a person's dialogue to change, you would literally have to run all the way back to the beginning of a game to be like, oh, let's see if they're done. Like, obviously some games make it a little easier. Obviously the Trails games make it a lot easier, just because it's like, oh, you'll leave this place and you'll come back at some point later on, in like 2, and the dialogue will be different, or like it's a different time of day. You get what I'm trying to say. I'm curious, like, to anyone out there about the whole, talking to NPCs thing. Do you make a conscious effort to do it, or you just think like it's too much? Because a lot of times I can understand, because it is a thing of like, it feels a little overwhelming, but at the same time it might seem like it's not worth it either, because it's like, oh, maybe 1 or 2 dialogues before the character repeats himself. But even then, I think it's fascinating, because it's just kind of like, I mean, because you also have to think about it too. It's like someone went through the trouble of writing that dialogue. Someone also went through the trouble of programming that dialogue. So for you to just kind of run past an NPC, it's a little disrespectful. When you actually kind of, I never think of it that. I never think of it like that consciously. But if you ever break it down and think of it like that, it is kind of like, oh, that is kind of a little messed up when you don't talk to every NPC. I mean, also, but like I said, just it presents certain opportunities. Like I said, you get to follow certain storylines that may not be the biggest storylines, but it's like if you talk to certain characters, you know, long enough, eventually you'll kind of learn a little bit about their background. And it's like, oh wow, this NPC actually knows a lot, you know, and it's like, oh, what's this NPC person's like whole deal? Because the fact is they have all this like knowledgeable like dialogue, and it's just like maybe it eventually will become something, maybe it won't. I don't know. It's just, it's always, you know, kind of fascinating. So my question to you once again, like, do you make an effort to talk to a lot of NPCs? Do you not? Are you like me where it's like you used to not do it, but now you made more of a point to try and do it? You know, I'd love to get to know your thoughts about the whole topic in the comments down below. But really, that's all I want to talk about. Until the next time we meet, be happy, be safe, live life to the fullest, and enjoy it. Good day and goodbye.